The Roman triumph was a spectacle of absolute order. A procession moved through the city along a predetermined route, a river of captured wealth and chained power flowing toward the Capitoline Hill. Gold, weapons, exotic animals, and finally, the defeated enemy commanders, paraded in their humiliation before being ritually executed in the Tullianum. This was the public script of victory, endorsed by the Senate and witnessed by the populace. It was a narrative of closure. The war was over. Rome had won, but the war for many was not over. For the vast majority of captives taken in a campaign, the non-combatants, the women, the children, there was no place in the triumph's choreography. Their procession was not public. It moved not toward the Forum, but toward the river. The Emporium, the commercial docks of Rome. Here beneath the Aventine Hill, the logic of war transitioned into the mechanics of commerce. The captives, now termed mancipia property, were processed. They were catalogued, assessed, and prepared for market. The Lanista, the owner of a gladiatorial school, was a frequent and privileged buyer at these docks. His needs were specific. He required male bodies of a certain size and temperament for the ludus, but his acquisitions were not limited to fighters. A separate transaction, less documented but understood within the trade, pertained to the women and adolescents. They were not purchased for the sand. Their destination was the barracks, the ancillae of the gladiatorial compound. The official record, if one was kept at this level, would use the sterile term servitia, servants, domestics. It was a plausible fiction. Every large household in Rome required staff. The ludus was a household of a unique and violent character. The gladiator's life was one of brutalized contradiction. He was simultaneously despised and adored, a slave and a potential celebrity. His existence was regulated down to the minute. Training, feeding, rest, all designed to produce a viable instrument for the arena. His world was male, pressurized, and perpetually one misstep away from a death sentence. The authority over him was total, embodied in the Lanista and his armed guards, the custodes. Into this pressurized environment, the female captives were inserted. Their prescribed role was domestic, to clean the barracks, mend the training gear, serve the meals. This placed them in a state of absolute vulnerability, surrounded by men who were themselves objects of state-sanctioned violence. They were, by legal and social definition, invisible. They existed outside the protections of family, tribe, or citizenship. They were, in the most precise Roman sense, res, things, property of the Lanista, to be utilized as he saw fit for the maintenance of his assets. The horror did not begin with a dramatic act of violence. It began with architecture. The design of a ludus was that of a secure prison. High walls, guarded gates, a single point of controlled entry and exit. For the gladiators, this was to prevent escape. For the captives within, it was a sealed ecosystem from which there was no appeal. Their overseers were the very men they served, and the ultimate authority, the Lanista, had a vested interest in the morale and compliance of his fighting stock. The maintenance of order within the walls was his prerogative. Thus, a silent compact was formed, enforced by structure and hierarchy. The gladiator, who faced ultimate violation in the public sand, could exercise a grim form of dominion in the private dark of the barracks. The captive, with no path to the outside world, no legal persona, became a component of the gladiator's psychological landscape, an outlet for rage, fear, and the perverse stress of his condition. It was a violence of convenience, sanctioned by the implicit economy of the school. The Lanista provided the bodies, the gladiators provided the spectacle. Any internal cost was absorbed by the invisible. This was the prelude. The captive's existence was one of suspended terror, awaiting the cyclical trigger of the arena itself, for the true mechanism of control was not daily routine, but the scheduled spectacle of death. The gladiator's victory in the sands was not an end. It was a license. The day of the games was a day of institutional tension. For the gladiator, it was a binary equation. Win and live, lose and die. The elaborate rituals of the arena, the parade, the testing of weapons, the salute to the editor, were a public theater of honor and rule. But the true weight of the contest was carried back behind the walls of the ludus, into a space governed by an unwritten code. A victory was not a return to normalcy. It was a transformation of status. The victor, still a slave in law, was elevated in practice. He was the munera prized investment, the crowd's momentary hero. He had spilled blood in the sanctioned space and been rewarded with life, palm fronds, and sometimes prize money. A psychic debt was incurred, a surge of adrenaline, relief, and brutalized pride that demanded an outlet. The rigid discipline of the school could not, and was not designed to, contain this pressure. The institution provided the outlet through calculated neglect. The Lannister and his custodians understood that a victorious gladiator was a volatile asset. To suppress him completely risked rebellion or a loss of the aggressive edge required for the next fight. Therefore, a perimeter of permissible transgression was established within the compound. So long as the fighting stock remained intact and trainable, internal matters were of little concern. The female captives existed within this perimeter. The method was one of deferred payment. The gladiator was not given a direct command. Instead, a systemic indifference was enacted. Following a victory, the normal nighttime security patterns within the barracks would subtly shift. Guards might be recalled from certain corridors. The heavy oak door to a cell block might be left unbolted from the outside. The captive's assigned sleeping area, often a separate but minimally secured alcove, might be found to have a malfunctioning lock. These were not accidents. They were the institution's silent endorsement. The gladiator, understanding this language of implied permission, would act. The act itself was not a frenzied assault, but a cold exercise of granted power. It was the enforcement of a hierarchy written in blood and sand. The captive, already broken by the totalizing reality of her captivity, had no recourse. To cry out was futile, the guards were conspicuously absent. To resist physically was impossible against a trained combatant. Her existence was a negative space defined by what could be done to her. This was the core of the horror, its bureaucratic chill. No order was written. No senator decreed it. It emerged from the functional necessities of maintaining a stable of human weapons. The captive was a pressure valve, a psychological sink. By absorbing the aftermath of the arena's violence, she served the state's purpose twice over, first as a token of conquest, then as a tool for maintaining the machinery that entertained the conquerors. Documentation of this practice is, predictably, absent from official histories. Roman historians chronicled laws, battles, and political scandals. The internal maintenance procedures of a gladiatorial school were beneath their notice. However, the structure speaks. Archaeological remains of ludi, such as the barracks in Pompeii, show a stark separation. The gladiators' cells were small but had fortified doors. Adjacent service areas are featureless, without security. The architectural message is one of absolute control flowing one way. Furthermore, the legal framework enabled it. Under Roman law, damage to another's property was a tort. If a gladiator killed or maimed a fellow gladiator, the Lannister suffered a financial loss and could punish the offender. But the captive's status was ambiguous. Was she valuable servitia or disposable preda, booty? Her worth was negligible next to a trained fighter. Any damage was an internal accounting matter, easily written off as the cost of doing business. The law saw only property affecting property, not a person suffering a crime. Thus, a perfect silence was engineered. The victims could not speak. The perpetrators had no incentive to speak. The authorities had no desire to listen. The violence was absorbed into the daily functioning of the institution, as routine and unremarkable as the sharpening of a sword or the repair of a net. It was the dark inverse of the public victory, a private, unrestrained conquest that ensured the victor remained pliable for the next public performance. The arena's spectacle required this hidden counter-ritual to sustain itself. The aftermath was not an event, but a condition. For the captive, there was no healing, no justice, no narrative of survival. There was only continuation. The bruises would fade. The physical injuries, if not fatal, would mend. But the architectural and social prison remained intact. The same walls, the same guards now returned to their posts. The same gladiator who had been granted license, now once again a fellow prisoner in the compound. The next games were already scheduled. The cycle was immutable. Her utility to the system was perpetual. She was a living testament to the gladiator's absolute dominion, a constant reminder that his power, though checked by the Lannister and the rules of the sand, was total within this private sphere. She became a psychological fixture, a part of the school's grim ecology. If she died from illness, injury, or despair, she was replaced from the next shipment at the Emporium. The supply chain of conquest was endless. She was a consumable resource. The true erasure began with language. Roman sources speak of the familia gladiatoria, the gladiatorial family. The term is a masterpiece of institutional camouflage. It evokes a bonded unit, a household. It sanitizes. Within this family, the captive was assigned the role of ancillae or serva. These words conjure the benign image of a maid in a villa, not a war captive in a barracks. This lexical shell game performed the dual function of normalizing the arrangement to the outside world and stripping the victim of any identity tied to her origins or her trauma. She was not a Briton, a Gaul, or a Judean. She was ancillae, a function. Even in the rare instances where the fate of female captives brushes against the historical record, it is filtered through this lens of utility. A passing mention in a text about the management of a ludus might note the cost of servants or the need for domestic staff. The horror is dissolved into ledgers and supply lists. The violence is not recorded because within the economic and social logic of the institution, it was not violence. It was maintenance. The legacy of this practice is not a statute, a speech, or a memorial. It is an absence. It is the silence in the archaeological record where personal artifacts of these women should be. Excavations of gladiator barracks yield belt buckles, armor fittings, gaming dice, and coins, the detritus of the fighters' lives. From the service quarters, nothing. No combs, no jewelry, no tokens of identity. They lived and died without leaving a material trace that could individualize them. Their eradication was total. This silence extends to the very memory of the games. The popular imagination, fed by frescoes and Hollywood, sees only the combat. It sees the clash of arms, the salute of the victor, the thumb of the crowd. It does not see the return to the barracks. It does not see the silent exchange of glances between the Lannister and the victor. It does not see the unbolted door. The arena's spectacle was so brilliant, so loud, and so bloody that it cast a shadow deep enough to hide everything that happened in its wake. The Colosseum stands today as a monument to engineered visibility. Every seat had a sightline to the sand. Every act of violence was public, ritualized, and given meaning. But the ludus was its necessary twin, a monument to engineered invisibility. What happened there was private, raw, and stripped of all meaning save power. The horror Rome tried to hide was not a singular, secret atrocity. It was the banal, operational underside of its most famous public entertainment. It was the understanding that the glory of the arena was subsidized by suffering that would never be commemorated, never be mourned, and never even be named. The captive's scream was swallowed by the same stone walls that echoed with the roar of the crowd just hours before. One sound was celebrated as civilization. The other was the price of its ticket, paid in a currency that left no historical receipt. There is no closure in this history, only an echo. It is the echo of a system that understood how to compartmentalize brutality, how to outsource its cruelty to the shadows of its own institutions, and how to write its records in such a way that the darkest pages appear, to all later readers, to be perfectly blank.